On to today a bit more about Capoeira and why I think it works so well to train with Choy Lee Fut. So I've got three main categories. Oh yeah, there's that one. Also about why it works so well for me personally, because there are definitely things about Capoeira that kind of work more for me than would necessarily work for other people who train Choy Lee Fut. And also, understanding how Capoeira works from an Eastern martial arts perspective. Yes, I'm going to talk about yin and yang, and also, Capoeira I feel is very much yin to the CLF yang that I do. I think it's quite interesting. So, first of all, there's so one thing that I've always thought was really, really missing from Choy Lee Fut was dodging. Okay, there's basically no dodging in Choy Lee Fut. It's a very strange thing to me. I've always thought it was a bit odd, and I've always found it a bit uncomfortable. But Capoeira, there's an awful lot of dodging, like so much dodging, and which we just do not have in Choy Lee Fut. There's no dodging, there's no evading really. It's all very, very aggressive. And that's one of the things that makes it such a yin style, to be honest, because it's about moving away. It's not pushing forwards or anything like that. I find that quite interesting, really. And I think I have heard a few people say who do Capoeira say it's not really a martial arts style. It's more an artistic expression. Yes, it's a very artistic, expressive thing, right? But I've got to say, first of all, you are kind of doing yourself down a bit. I watched a video a little while back, about a few weeks ago, about Tai Bo, which I think was very popular in the 80s or something. It's not now, but it was quite interesting how they do kind of have a similar approach to kicks. So there's a lot of like putting the upper body downwards to kick upwards, like hands on the floor, which is something that they do in Capoeira a lot, and it makes for very effective kicking. And one time I had someone accidentally kicked me, like got me with the bridge of their foot on this cheekbone, and they didn't mean to, they just weren't quite looking. It wasn't like they were trying to kick, they weren't kicking very hard or anything like that. It still hurt, I can tell you. Like, if he'd been trying to, if he'd been aiming for me, if he'd done that really hard, potentially could have knocked me out. I do think that just because you don't do that many hand strikes, I don't think that it's still a martial art. There's a lot of there's still a lot that involves like actual attacking, and I think that does make it martial art. It may not make it a martial art in the same way that Choy Lee Fut is, but it is still a martial art. There's still quite a strong martial element to it. But also, I find it kind of funny, like, what do you think of is a martial art? I mean, a lot of the stuff that's in Capoeira, it's about evading. I think evading is an important part of martial arts, actually, and the acrobatics and stuff, they're often used for evasion and for distraction, and that's often part of martial arts as well. It may not be a really aggressive style, but there are definitely styles that would have trouble with it, like the close range styles, particularly, like Wing Chun, would have a lot of trouble with somebody who does Capoeira, because they just easily evade anything that anyone who does Wing Chun would try to do. I'm not going to say, I think they'd probably still have trouble with my advanced Choy Lee Fut, but I think it's really interesting, like there's so much a lack of ego that goes on, there's a bit of a temptation for them to sit themselves down, I think. Now, I'm going to get into, so that's one thing that Choy Lee Fut doesn't have that they have in Capoeira that's really important and is really, I feel, really important for me personally, because I really didn't like the fact that there was like no dodging in Choy Lee Fut. So next thing is that there's very leg based, lots of kicks, I like that. There's a lot of emphasis on maintaining your stability while moving, which is also very important in Choy Lee Fut. So there are a number of kicks in Choy Lee Fut. There's probably like, I mean, there are definitely styles that do more kicking than Choy Lee Fut, but I think there's a bit of a temptation to think of Choy Lee Fut as not having that many kicks, but I think in comparison to a lot of Kung Fu styles, it does do a fair amount of kicking. Yeah, like obviously it's not like Taekwondo or what's it, Thai kickboxing, Muay Thai, but it does do a fair amount of kicking, and there's a very strong emphasis on strong, stable stances, flow, being able to move and maintain your balance, and it's just kind of more of that kind of training, which I think is extremely helpful. It's also a lot of exercise, right? You need a lot of stamina to do capoeira well. So it's a lot of exercise. There's like about half-hour warm-up, which I've said before, which I think is really important, and I personally like to do that. And there's a reason for that, which is that it's quite a lot of work. So, and you know, I've actually lost 7 pounds since I started doing capoeira, which is like, I knew I was carrying a little bit of excess, more weight than I necessarily needed to, but I was quite surprised. I'm actually like, I could potentially fight as a welterweight in MMA, you know, if women were allowed to fight at welterweight, which they're not. But anyway, so another thing that it's really good for is that it kind of keeps moving at odd angles. So yeah, you do the kicks in odd ways. You kind of you try and sort of move around at odd angles. Do the kicks from ways you wouldn't necessarily expect. And the evasion is also very odd angles. So it's like you kind of, there's a lot of like, you go back on one hand, then the other, then move your legs around a bit, and you're suddenly somewhere else. So it's there's a whole lot of stuff in that, which I feel like is just going to add to the way that we do things in Choy Lee Fut, where we kind of, it's a lot of moving around at different angles and stuff, and I think that's really great. So then there's the acrobatics. So I think that it's very easy to kind of poo-poo acrobatics, and people do, but first of all, you need a lot of stamina. You need to do those acrobatics. It's, you know, they're quite hard work. I'm still not able to do a handstand, I don't think. Cartwheels, okay, but I think it's a sort of a lack of understanding. Just because they're not actually hitting people, then sort of they think there's a tendency to think that it's like useless or something. But I mean, like I said, they're good for, you know, maintaining your stamina and your capability for movement, which is very important, obviously. But then there's also the fact that actually Choy Lee Fut uses acrobatics a fair bit. We do a lot of jumping, a lot of turning. There's some tumbles that you do, and okay, so I don't think this was the thing in Choy Lee Fut, but historically, Kung Fu schools for shows did often add acrobatics to make it look good, basically. So like way back in feudal China, when there was, like, I mean, there's still very few ways you can make money from martial arts now. Back then, there's basically 3 ways. You could teach, or you could hire yourself out as muscle for either a rich person or maybe a village. Because back in those days, there was no, well, there were police, but there was like no pretense that the police were there to protect the citizens. There was like any citizen protection like the average peasant required, they had to do for themselves. The government wasn't doing shit for them, right? They didn't see it as the, peasants were just there to serve them, you know. So they had to do their own thing, and so quite often, if there were, and then you get like bandits, marauding gangs, and stuff like that. And so quite often, thing that you might do as a martial artist is hire yourself out to a village to be their protection from these bandits and stuff. So that was a way. And another way, a third way, was to put on shows in marketplaces. And so you'd get martial arts schools who would do like a big show, and then they'd like hand around a cap or whatever to collect money for doing their show. And quite often they would add in acrobatics, extra little tricks and stuff that weren't really, strictly speaking, necessary for the martial art, but they made a good show. So I think there is a sort of strange way of underestimating the importance of a good show, because I personally recognise, and I feel like a lot, this isn't said enough probably, but there's an awful lot of showmanship and an awful lot of posturing in martial arts, and there's a reason for that, okay? You do that because that way you're not fighting, right? If you're kind of showing how good you are, you're showing how brilliant you are, that kind of means that other people are less likely to, have a go at you. So I think that, people do kind of underestimate how important that is for just martial arts generally, I think. I think, I do think that the acrobatics are actually kind of, I don't think that the fact that they do acrobatics really takes away from the fact that it's a martial style, because I do think that it can be important. It can be very helpful. Another thing I find is like there's this kind of lack of egos and a very non-hierarchical. Now they do have their maestros and stuff. They're very well respected teachers. I met one last year when they did a kind of big group thing, and but it was kind of interesting because I still didn't see that kind of ego in him that I would expect to see in, say, some Grand High Sifu, whatever. Like there's an awful lot of ego goes on in a lot of martial arts, but I have yet to see it that much expressed in capoeira. I'm sure there's egos that go around, okay, but it doesn't seem to be there in my local group, and it doesn't seem like when I've met people from other groups who are like considered quite important, it's not really there either, in certainly not in the way that you would expect to see it in other things. And that's kind of why it works for me personally, I would say. I tend to have a lot of difficulties with people with big egos. That's just how it is. People with big egos do tend to hate me. So it's kind of good for that. And I quite like the fact that I am just not a big deal, really. Because quite often if I'm a big deal, it's generally in a very negative way. It was so horrible in a lot of ways being in lessons with Neil, because it always felt like I was the centre of everything, even though I was only there for like 1 or 2 lessons a week, but it seemed like I was dominating everyone's thoughts or something. It was very uncomfortable. It's not nice at all. So I kind of like the fact that I am just another person, just like everybody else who's in the lesson. It's great. So I think we're going to talk about music now. Now, for me personally, music is really important. You can see that I use it a lot in my my performances, in my videos where I perform, and it's kind of interesting to me. Like you probably see, like, the music has to be playing while I do the performances, right, before the videos. Like, it won't work without it, in my opinion. Now, I can do the performances without it, certainly, but it won't be the same performance. It just won't. And so for me, the music is integral to my performances. So, and an interesting thing about Capoeira is that music is integral to the Capoeira performances. Like, it is so important, right? When we do the rodas, the games where it's kind of, you're testing yourself, you're working on your skills, testing them against others. The music has to play, right? And if the song that's being played comes to an end, you have to stop, you're expected to stop and then go back to the side of the circle where the musicians are. You start from where the musicians are and the singers, and you wait to start again when the music starts again and a new song starts. And I think it's quite often like you don't like go immediately when a new song starts. You kind of wait a minute, maybe when the singing starts. But it is extremely important. Like, that is how important it is, and they always have music playing during the lesson. Because the music is just so important with that, and I'll go into that a little bit more later. But I think that's partly why it works so well for me personally, because music isn't necessarily that important to quite a lot of people who do Choy Lee Fut. And that's all of that covered, I would say. Now we're going to get into Capoeira being yin to the yang of Choy Lee Fut. Now, I'm going to sort of start by talking an interesting way that things worked. I've often found with my martial arts, with Choy Lee Fut, that there is a way that things happen together. So as soon as I went to my first Choy Lee Fut lesson in January, the first week of January 2012, and then I went to my first meditation lesson in the second week of January 2012. And so my meditation practice started pretty much at the same time as Choy Lee Fut, and I do feel like that's very important. It's always been very important for me to keep up with meditation, and I still practice every day. So, meditation is important if you're practicing a martial art to keep you grounded, because it's very easy as a martial artist, especially when you get really advanced, to kind of become arrogant to the point, like, there are so many egos, like I have mentioned, and my former Kung Fu teacher, for example, thinks he's a reincarnation of the Buddha. He doesn't quite explicitly say it, but he basically says it on his website several times. His former teacher, my former grandmaster, he kind of thinks he's a reincarnation of the Yellow Emperor. This is not something he's explicitly said, but it's been something that has come across to me from observing him. He basically thinks he is a god, and says his wife, I think she thinks she's some kind of, but anyway, and then like my former teacher's ex-wife, she seemed to kind of think she was a goddess of mercy, a reincarnation of the goddess of mercy. I think she's kind of let go of that one now. I think her interaction with me has possibly made her realise she's not that merciful necessarily. But anyway, so I think it's so this is why meditation has always been extremely important for me, right? Because it is very easy to start thinking too much of yourself, start thinking you're some kind of superhero. seen it happen. I swear, like, there are going to be plenty of martial artists who died because they kind of thought they could keep going through stuff that they couldn't. And I think Matthew Polly kind of said that, basically said that about Bruce Lee, that, you know, Bruce Lee kind of thought he could push through anything, and that's part of what killed him. I mean, I think obviously it's more complicated than that, but he did say that was part of the issue with Bruce Lee and him dying. So, yeah, so why am I bringing this up with capoeira? Well, so capoeira is, I'm going to go into it a bit, but it's very yin style, it's very leg based, like I've said, it's dodging a lot, it's kind of, these are all very yin things, okay? You kind of go to the ground a lot with your hands, which you all don't do that much in Choy Lee Fut. So I started learning that. I went to my first capoeira lesson like 2 days after I started learning rope dart, which is one of the most yang things, right? One of the most yang weapons that you can think of, because it's literally just flying through the air. You don't do, I mean, you do a little bit with your legs, like you do some leg wraps and stuff, but it is like, you know, swirling something around the air, chucking it, bringing it back and stuff like that. That's a very yang thing. It's so yang, and I feel like it's quite interesting that the reason I started capoeira at that point, by the way, is because I saw my sister on the Thursday, and she said she'd been on a date with a man who went to this capoeira group, and he thought this capoeira was really cool, this group was really lovely, and he really missed it. And I was like, oh wow, there's capoeira, I had no idea. So I immediately looked up. So that was the Thursday. The Saturday I started learning the rope dart, and then I went to my first capoeira lesson on the following Monday. And I feel like it's been very important, because I think with something like, when you do stuff with rope dart, like, you have to be very careful. You can easily hurt yourself. I think it could have been very easy for me with learning that to start thinking of myself as better in a way that could have ended up being harmful for me. And I don't know, maybe it's still, well, who knows. But so like, I know that I've like posted me doing rope dart, and you know, I've had people on Reddit say, oh God, you really need to put a sponge on that or something on the end to stop, you'll have your eye out, stuff. Like, people have been like very keen to tell me I'm going to hurt myself with my rope dart, which I never have, not really. I mean, maybe a little bit, but like certainly nothing to worry about, really. So yeah, I think it could have been very easy, but I think sort of I mean, it also, like, being in lessons with other people is very important, right? Because I've basically had to learn on my own for years, and it's not been great. I haven't liked it. But I do think, like, if you're in a lesson around other people, that kind of helps bring you down to earth a bit, really. And yeah, also, I was going to that as a beginner, and that's a very grounding experience, as I think I mentioned before. So it's sort of interesting to me that I was seeing my kind of learning my most yang weapon yet, and that was when I started doing the capoeira, which is a very yin style. Now, obviously, like I said, the dodges are a very yin thing. Evading, it's very yin. It's kind of like, I mean, receiving is kind of a yin thing that you do, but you kind of like avoiding being hit. That's yeah. Whereas Choy Lee Fut, it's so aggressive. There's so many hand strikes. I cannot begin to tell you, like, and I love that. I absolutely love it. I love all the hand strikes. I love the complexity, the combinations. I love it. but that does make it a very yang style, because it's actually very much based a lot more on what you do now with your hands. Now you can, now obviously, like I said, there's a very strong emphasis in Choy Lee Fut on your stances, and you cannot do those hand strikes properly if you haven't got your stance right. I mean, whenever I have learned Choy Lee Fut, what I have often found is that I really need to make a point of learning my stances properly before adding the hand strikes to the stances as I learn a form. That's what I found. So yes, the stances are very important, but still you are using those stances to be very aggressive with your hands. And yes, you're being very aggressive with your feet as well. There are a fair number of kicks in Choy Lee Fut, but you know, nothing like as much in Capoeira. I've definitely learned more kicks, I would say, in the last 10 months in Capoeira than I've probably learned in Choy Lee Fut in 12 years. So there's a lot more kicking goes on. So obviously that's a more ground based, and like I said, it involves going to the ground a lot more. You know, you put your hands on the ground to do some of the kicks. Like, that is a very yin thing to be doing. It's sort of so near the ground, whereas everything you do in Choy Lee Fut is so up there. Not everything, to be fair, right? Obviously there's like quite a strong emphasis on the low stances, but that's a lot more about being stable than, you know, necessarily because you want to hit low. You don't want to hit low necessarily. Quite a lot of time you do sometimes, but that's not really necessarily what the low stances in Choy Lee Fut are about. So I think that's a very important thing to understand about like the differences and why I would say Capoeira is a very yin style. Another thing is there's almost no jumping in Capoeira. Like I said, there is acrobatics, but a lot of it's like handstands and cartwheels. There's tumbles as well, I think, to an extent, but not much in the way of jumping, it has to be said. Like, a little bit, but not a lot. Whereas there is a lot of jumping in Choy Lee Fut, a lot of turning in the air, you know, which is not what you do in Capoeira. The turning is often very ground based. It's moving around on your hands and your feet and moving your legs around, like unfolding and folding your legs in different ways so that you can move quickly on the ground, around on the ground. So you're not moving around in the air very much, which is what you do in Choy Lee Fut. A lot of jumping, a lot of it's really interesting. So again, that's kind of a yin thing in Capoeira and more of a yang, whereas yang thing in Choy Lee Fut. And I was going to say, obviously there are a lot of hand strikes in Choy Lee Fut. I have learned one hand strike in Capoeira in the 10 months that I've been here. One. That's it. And I'm not, there's blocks as well. You do a bit of blocking. Actually not that much because it relies a lot more on dodging. But there is some blocking. More blocking I've learned than hand strikes. Now Choy Lee Fut does have a lot of blocking. But often that's kind of like it'll block and there'll be deflecting, catching kicks and stuff like that in Choy Lee Fut. But it's no dodging. It's just so funny to me. But so it is just like one hand strike in Capoeira, and otherwise there's a few blocks and it's mostly evading. So it's like that seems to me like a very kind of a yin thing to just emphasise kicks very much over hands, and like if you are using hands, it is mostly for blocking. So you see this classic movement. It's about blocking. That's what that's about. So and again, blocking is not a yang thing, it's more of a yin thing. So I think, yeah, there's almost no evasion or distraction in Choy Lee Fut. It's just like it does not happen. Yeah, so I think it's probably worth pointing out that with Choy Lee Fut, the emphasis is so much on striking, on aggression, that, you know, if you do, the flow is often about like follow-up strikes. So you've got the combos, which yes, they might include a block, but then it's really just so you can smash something in some way, you know. And there's like no feinting either in Choy Lee Fut, really. We don't do that. It is literally just like maybe blocking or deflecting to just smash something. That it yeah, it's just really so aggressive in comparison to Capoeira. But again, I would say that doesn't necessarily mean that Capoeira is not a martial art. I would say that it is. It just doesn't present in the same way that a lot of martial arts do. And now I think the fact that music is integral to Capoeira is a really interesting and important thing. So music is yang energy. Basically, it is sound that goes through the air. It is yang energy. That's what it is. It's not solid. It's not movement-y. I mean, it's kind of movement through the air, but it's not movement in the way that, you know, actual like moving your hands is or anything like that. And so the thing is that I think that this comes from the fact that it is such a yin style. You know, Capoeira is so based on the ground, it kind of needs that yang energy of music to lift it up quite a lot, because you know, it is so important, right, that you know, you stop if the music stops and you go back to the side and you stop and end next to the musicians, right? So you have the circle, you have the musicians on one side, and then you people in the circle, and you have to start next to the musicians and then go into the circle. And so you kind of have to start getting that energy from the musicians. And then yes, when you bring it to an end, it's like you stop the music, and that's bringing it to an end. And you have to stop if the song comes to an end. You don't start again. You go back to where the musicians are, start when the song starts, and so on. So it's just like, I think that now I do not know like what the thinking was in the development of Capoeira, but it's sort of very obvious to me from looking at it from an Eastern martial arts perspective, where you think of everything in terms of yin and yang, that the music is required for Capoeira to work, because you need the music, the yang energy of the music, to lift the Capoeira when you are actually performing Capoeira. And I do feel that it's sort of interesting to me that they kind of like, there is a very definite understanding of energy and how it works in Capoeira. So like I said, you have the circle. Now you are supposed to have a circle round the people doing the hodders, playing the sort of game where they're interacting with their own movements and practicing their movements. And yeah, so the circle is supposed to be closed enough, so it's not like, you're not supposed to have like one person there, one person, like everyone here. You're supposed to have people evenly spread around the circle to contain the energy. And this is how they always talk about it, right? So you have to have the circle not too big. If the circle's too big, then the energy from the people who are playing will get too dissipated and too much, I guess. So you have to, the circle is required to contain the energy. That's how they put it. And then when you're bringing the game to an end, the hodder to an end, everybody is supposed to kind of contract in the circle, like come towards the musicians, and to bring the energy in, to pull the energy down, kind of. So yeah, it's sort of quite interesting to me that they do have this understanding of how energy works. They just don't think of it in terms of yin and yang, because, like, well, that's just not where it comes from. I had this. They had this woman who was visiting from New York. She was doing some lecture at the UEA, and but she was also a capoeira teacher, and she came to a lesson to help with her jet lag. So, but yeah, I mean, she was talking about the energy there. So she was talking about how you have to get the energy, you stay by the music to get the energy from the music, and then you are getting the energy from the ground, and then you are kind of thinking about how you're drawing in energy from people around you. It's just really interesting, and I would love to know more about, like, where this comes from. See, like, I think it's very tempting probably to think of it as just like, oh, you know, all comes from instinct with these black slaves who are uneducated, and I don't know. I think it's very tempting to think of it that way, but I do know that African culture has a kind of a long, rich history of, like, ritual and beliefs and stuff like that, and I have no doubt that a lot of that fed into the development of capoeira. So I kind of think there's probably a lot more interesting stuff to learn about that, about the understanding of energy that feeds into how capoeira developed and continues to develop. So I think last thing I'm going to talk about the hodders. Now, as time when the one of the teachers said to me while we were in the hodder, he said, "Oh, this is like sparring, right?" And I said, "No, it's actually more like pushing hands." Now, if you do know anything about Tai Chi, you know that in Tai Chi you have this form of combat called pushing hands, and you're not actually supposed to hit each other. You're not allowed to hit. You're not allowed to grab or anything like that. You're supposed to just push, basically. That's literally all you're supposed to do. And the idea is to push your opponent off balance. That's, you know, the first person normally to lift their foot off the floor is the one who loses. Okay, so yeah, that's kind of how it works. And a lot of it is feeling out your opponent, being very sensitive to what they're doing and kind of understanding them. And to be honest, that's kind of what you're doing in hodders a lot of the time. You know, like, it's a very interactive game, so you're kind of trying your kicks, and as you're trying your kick at them, they're trying their evading techniques. And you're not actually supposed to hit each other. So this seems to me like a very yin way of playing, because you know, in sparring you are actually supposed to hit. Now, I'm not saying you don't hit anyone in hodders. It does happen. Sometimes it's an accident. Sometimes you just want to play it that way. It depends. But the idea is with the hodders is that you learn your techniques without, like, getting hurt, basically. And yeah, so and that's kind of what you're doing in Tai Chi, and you know, you're learning to feel out an opponent without, and understand how to basically trip them up without hurting them. Whereas, like, certainly in Choy Lee Fut, there is quite a lot more emphasis on, like, drills, using pads, I guess, and using kick shoes and stuff, and, like, you know, even like one-to-one sparring, there is a lot more emphasis on that. Now, a sort of interesting thing, I watched a video by Jesse Enkamp a few weeks ago where he was talking about how hardly anyone spars anymore at a top level. I think Shane Faison was saying a while back that he doesn't spar anymore. And now, another interesting thing that Jesse Enkamp was talking about there was that actually you learn best through play. So you learn best when you are not stressed. Okay, so you know, chucking a ball for a dog is learning to run after some prey when they run after a ball, but it's play. You learn best through play. You don't learn very well if you are under this under a lot of stress, which is kind of what sparring does, you know, especially hard sparring. It's going to put you under stress because you're worried about being hit. So I would say that although it's not necessarily what you would call sparring, it's a good way to learn. It's probably a better way to learn than hard sparring. And this, yeah, I think a lot of I don't know if like the reasons for the lack of sparring in MMA people and stuff like that is because of the stress or not learning so well. But I think they do kind of feel like they're not learning so well through it. But obviously also there's the possibility of getting injured. So, you know, I think that is just about it. And just say, you know, just emphasise, I really would be interested in learning more about how energy is thought about in capoeira, because they clearly do think about that a lot. But yeah, they just don't know. But I hope you find this quite interesting, and I kind of hope it adds to understanding of like how different martial arts work, and how, you know, they could interact with each other, you know, because there's a whole lot of martial arts out there that could probably be interacting with each other in different ways.